Now that the dust has finally settled on Revolution of the Daleks, probably the most eagerly anticipated Doctor Who episode for years, it felt right to reassess all the festive specials of the modern era and attempt to formulate some form of definitive ranking. Of course, the greatest Christmas episode of the show is the amazing Paul McGann audio drama The Chimes of Midnight, but as I'm not counting Big Finish, that won't make the list. Instead, I'll be going through all the Christmas and New Year's specials since the revival in 2005, so no Feast of Stephen on here either. I found this list interesting to do, because it made me realise how differently all the different eras did their specials. Disclaimer, despite loving the RTD era a million times more than I love the Chibnall era, I'm very mixed about the RTD Christmas specials. So unfortunately, not all of the Tennant outings did well on this list. Just thought I'd give you a heads up about that, because that's the sort of thing that tends to provoke shouty men in comment sections. Anyway, that's more than enough preamble. It's time for my definitive ranking of Doctor Who's festive specials. In last place, The Next Doctor. Occupying an unfortunate bottom spot on this list is the 2008 Christmas special that followed one of the greatest series of the show. I'm going to be upfront about this one, I'm really not a fan. This one sees the Cybermen being thrown back into the 19th century, where they proceed to not convert any humans, just a couple of dogs for some reason, and then build a 200-foot mechanical Cyberman who looks like Preston from Wallace and Gromit. This one starts with real promise, with the Doctor arriving in a Dickensian Victorian setting, which is a distinctly Christmassy and feels like a perfect setting for a Christmas special. In fact, the first segment of this episode is its best, with a really fun opening chase sequence and the planting of the mystery of who David Morrissey's Doctor is. After that, though, it all goes to pot. Positives first, though, and most of them come in the form of the magnificent David Morrissey, who puts in a fantastic turn as both this mysterious Doctor and also the emotionally damaged Jackson Lake, who has lost so much. His companion Rosita is a joy, and also her punch on Miss Hartigan being the undisputed highlight of the episode. Mary Gold is on fire as ever, as is David Tennant. It's just a shame there are so many problems. The Cybermen being one of the main ones. As someone whose favourite villain is the Cybermen, it's safe to say I have pretty strong opinions about them. The Cyber Shades are a nice idea, but they're totally pointless and add absolutely nothing to the story, whilst the Cybermen have long since outstayed their welcome, and are just such a bland, uninteresting take on the iconic villains by this point. They don't lean into the body horror even remotely, and come across as nothing more than generic robots. The Cyber King itself is the main problem here. It's an atrocious idea that is so over the top. I feel like RTD felt he just had to keep outdoing himself, whereas we didn't need the stakes to be upped again. In fact, this story would have benefited from a smaller scale. I feel the story would have worked better as a creepy Dickensian Victorian tale, with the mystery of Jackson Lake and without the Cybermen. Whilst David Morrissey is a gem, I feel the fantastic Dervla Kirwan's acting talents are totally wasted, despite a few good moments as Miss Hartigan. Her "hell hath no fury like a woman scorned" motivation is nowhere near as interesting a motivation as if it was her experience in the workhouse and her desire to eradicate poverty that persuaded her to join forces with the Cybermen, in order to make everyone truly equal. As it is, she's just hacked off with sexism and wants to have some fun bossing men about. It's a bit of a weak motivator for helping eradicate your own species. I've soured considerably towards the story since I first viewed it, because it feels like it's just too over the top, and it's such a waste of an opportunity. I feel bad putting it at the bottom of the list, but for one, there isn't a totally awful festive special, and in my defence, it's basically all the Cyber King's fault. It's an awful idea, executed badly. However, as with most Christmas specials, it does end with some gorgeous moments, particularly the Bravo Sir moment, and the beautiful discussion about companions. In 14th, I've gone for The Doctor, the Widow and the Wardrobe. Overhated and underrated, this one is a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. Well, by that I mean I don't mind it and find it a harmless bit of fun. Even if the actual story about acid rain and a bunch of trees is pretty much a non-starter. The disappointingly thin Narnia connection aside, I mean, as a massive Narnia fan, I'm still holding out for a story where we meet C.S. Lewis and go to the land of fiction and construct Narnia, but this episode probably killed that dream. For me though, all the tree stuff is second to the character stuff. It's not about saving a forest, that's all secondary. It's about bringing a war-torn family together at Christmas. And it's Christmas, I'll forgive them for that. There is a gorgeous magical feeling to this episode that was so prevalent in Matt Smith's era of the show. His childish enthusiasm about the repairs is infectious, and the most 11th Doctor thing ever. The sidecast are great as well, such as Holly Earle's Lily, and particularly Claire Skinner as Madge, who has some amazing scenes. Particularly that scene with Matt Smith where they talk about why she's so angry with her children for being happy. It's such a poignant and beautifully written moment. There's just a nice melancholic fun to this episode, even if it totally loses me when Bill Bailey rocks up for 5 minutes. They appear to be on Androzani, which is a nice callback, even if the Doctor calls it one of the safest planets he knows. He clearly has a different recollection of Androzani than I do. The acid rain plot with the souls of the trees is rubbish, but the emotional stuff more than keeps this one off the bottom of the list. And yes, I know that Madge saving her husband by flying through the time vortex is silly, but as I said, it's Christmas. Give me that heartwarming family reunion. I'll forgive it. The best scene here, of course, is that beautiful final scene when the Doctor reunites with Amy and Rory. It's such a gorgeous ending to the episode with its humany-womany happy crying that sets the groundwork perfectly for the new dynamic between Amy, Rory and the Doctor in Series 7. 13th, The Runaway Bride. Okay, The Runaway Bride. Controversial, I know, but I really find this one to be middling in the extreme. It's above The Widow in the Wardrobe because it's just an absolute blast, and it's a really great episode of the show if you're just wanting to have fun with it, but when you actually analyse it, it's a bit frustrating. The talent of Sarah Parish is totally wasted under about 3 foot of prosthetics as the Ragnos, leading to an incredibly hammy performance as she struggles to speak clearly through that mask. The Ragnos are a great idea on paper, but I'm not sure that design totally works in hindsight. Obviously it worked well enough for Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror to rip it off 14 years later, but then what RTD stuff hasn't the Chibnall era ripped off at this point? It's a weird one for me because there's some stuff that is just out and out rubbish. For example, the Return of the Santa robots, my least favourite part of the Christmas Invasion. I'm not a fan of the campy weaponisation of Christmas in the first couple of RTD Christmas specials, and the flying Christmas baubles being used as grenades is an all-time low of this trope. Even Catherine Tate is way too... well, Catherine Tate in this one. It's like she's playing a standard gobby Catherine Tate character, like Lauren Cooper, rather than the much more complex, layered and lovable Donna Noble we would get to know in Series 4. Although she is still great in this story, particularly at the end, she's just not quite there yet. There is also the problem of a high number of obvious plot holes, and why exactly was Lance willing to allow the entire planet to be consumed by ravenous carnivores? Human villains are difficult to make work if they team up with aliens in terms of their motivations, and this is one of the prime examples of that problem. Tobias Vaughn, this guy is not. All of this stuff is frustrating because there is some really great stuff in here, such as a bombastic TARDIS chase sequence on a motorway, the Doctor committing a lovely Christmas genocide, and this shot of Tennant, which is my favourite shot of him ever. Everything missing from Whittaker's performance is captured perfectly in the rage of the Time Lord here. So The Runaway Bride is a bit of a weird one, fun yet dark, which I love, but then there are some RTD era shenanigans and camp which I could just really do without. 12th, the most recent installation, Revolution of the Daleks. I can't lie, when this episode ended following 10 months of desperate anticipation, I felt incredibly dejected and disappointed. In hindsight, that was slightly harsh, as this one was decent enough, but I wasn't a big fan. Having gone through the internet, it transpires I'm in a minority in that opinion, and that's okay. I'm starting to feel like this era just isn't for me. I'm really making an effort, but the stories aren't making it easy. This one has all the ingredients it needs, and yet it ends up being a bit of a mess in my eyes. It was marketed as how will the companions fare facing the Daleks without the Doctor, and I was excited for that premise, only for Jodie to be broken out of prison before the plot actually begins. If there was one thing I didn't want, it was for the prison cliffhanger to go nowhere, and it didn't. You can say she spent decades there all you like. If it's 3 minutes of screen time, it means nothing. That could have been forgivable if the escape was decent, but it was so disappointing. Instead of the Doctor masterminding a motley crew of aliens into some madcap Guardians of the Galaxy style prison break that I was hoping for, Jack turns up, they get in a bubble, and within 11 seconds have reached Jack's room, have found a vortex manipulator, and now they're out. And the episode didn't just get on with it. Such a waste of a great cliffhanger. Also, is this prison Shada? Are they going to address that? Because I really need to know. The Daleks get about a minute of being effective when they're killing a bunch of people, but contrary to the people who say this is a return to form for the Daleks, in my eyes it's a downgrade after the vastly superior Dalek action in Resolution. There is just too much going on to properly land any of it. Some guy called Leo creates a bunch of Daleks to hijack the new drones, so the Doctor just summons up another Dalek army, who promptly and anticlimactically deal with that one. I think it was the hope that killed my enjoyment of this one. There was the promise of a Dalek invasion, which is a bit of a non-entity at the end of the day, because the Daleks end up just fighting each other, and most of that's off-screen, and we never get to see the consequences to actual people of the Dalek invasion we got. There was promise of a Dalek civil war, just like in Remembrance, my favourite Dalek story of all time. But it just ends up being one anticlimactic fight scene on a bridge, with the rest of it off-screen. I was looking forward to Dalek on Dalek violence, but the end result was just so bland compared to the amazing Dalek fighting of Remembrance. In fact, as fun as it was seeing the Daleks again, they were sort of second place to character stuff. Now, a lot of this character stuff actually worked for the first time in Chibnall's era. Jodie worked slightly better for me as the Doctor, during those moments when she was a little bit more sombre and on the edge, despite the fact that she still saddled with her usual cringy dialogue. She's actually felt somewhat imposing and much less out of her depth. Similarly, Yaz was my highlight of the episode. I think at long last she's starting to become a truly great companion. By contrast, much like Series 11 and 12, Ryan was absolute deadwood. He got a ridiculously long scene talking to the Doctor, but it would feel much more effective if we weren't 22 episodes into Ryan's character, and this be the first personal conversation I can actually remember between him and the Doctor. Also, side note, 4 minutes to Asaka. 4 minutes. That's absolute nonsense. The TARDIS can get to the end of the universe quicker than that. They just needed an excuse to have a talk. And actually, this scene was my least favourite in the whole story. Other than it left me shouting at my TV, I'm not who I thought I was. Yeah, you are, shut up. I wasn't even born in Gallifrey. Yeah, you are, shut up. When this is all over, we'll find out who you really are. Please, please, please don't. Seriously, please don't. There was also the problem that we need to stop the episode every time anyone has a serious character discussion. And that was the real issue here. It fell into a lot of the issues I've had with Chibnall's era as a whole. Too many characters that you never feel connected to any of them. Too many plot points not focused on. Not enough action, stakes or excitement. Manufactured character moments that don't come naturally within the flow of the story, but we instead stop the episode dead in its tracks to facilitate this, and then a plot resolution that, whilst being clever, left me going, is that it? Surely that's not it. There's still 15 minutes left, surely that's not it. And it was. I wanted an emotional character exit. What we got felt weak and unearned. A companion walking away from the Doctor can work. See Martha Jones, who realises that the Doctor has never appreciated her, that she suffered and that their relationship is unhealthy. And it makes the mature and responsible decision to walk away. By contrast, Ryan says, my mates need me, and then proceeds to plan a holiday to Finland and Korea to investigate some stuff. I'm not saying I wanted a companion death, but I wanted a companion death and then the other to walk away, something that could have made a lasting impression on this Doctor. Instead, Ryan just rides off on a bike and the Doctor just naffs off for some more wacky adventures. Also, the big plus in this episode was John Barrowman, who was on one hand an absolute joy, but unfortunately, after getting the Doctor out of prison, was totally wasted and didn't get enough time on screen with the Doctor herself to make an impression as a duo. Also, did he seriously not get a proper goodbye? Seriously? The pacing was bizarre, it was too stop-start, too many ideas with not enough time. On paper, this should be great. It just doesn't work here for me. I know I've complained a lot about this episode, but I actually did enjoy it. It's just frustrating because this should have been so much better. It was a Dalek invasion without stakes, a Dalek civil war without action, a companion departure story without any earned emotion, and Jack's big return that didn't actually spend much time with Jack. I think this was probably a decent episode, ruined for me by 10 months of anticipation, poor marketing, and at the end of the day, some poor writing. I'm just going to give up getting excited for Chibnall's Who, and then if it gets good, it'll catch me off my guard, and I'll enjoy it all the more. 11th. The Time of the Doctor. I really wish I could love this one. Matt Smith's era is possibly my favourite of the whole show. It's definitely my favourite of New Who, and it's a bit of a shame that it ends up on a bit of an inconsistent bump in the road like this. I've heard it said that Moffat got the arc wrong in this story, but in my eyes he knows exactly what he's doing. He's just got so many loose ends to tie up, that whilst he manages to tie them all up nicely, there is no room for the story to breathe, and subsequently it feels like a story that should have been an epic, but ends up feeling more like a series of revelations. There is a good reason for this though. Moffat thought that Smith was going to stay for another series, and had planned to take a whole series to tie up the Trenzalore arc, but then was forced to do it within 60 minutes. So honestly, I feel for the Moff. He couldn't have done much better in the time that he did, although the pointless cameo of the Weeping Angels and a wooden Cybermen are infuriating inclusions. And to add to that, 60 minutes to tie up the arc problem, there's also the added pressure of this being a Christmas special, and therefore requiring some Christmassy shenanigans, this being provided by Clara's Christmas dinner. Speaking of Clara, it's between this episode and Day of the Doctor that I really start loving her, and she seems fully recovered from her lack of personality that she suffered from in Series 7. Tasha Lem is a bit of a pointless distraction, but there is that sort of quirky, whimsical, magical fairy tale about this story, which is absolutely what I want from a Christmas special, but particularly a Matt Smith Christmas special. There are some genius ideas in here, really genius, but maybe too many ideas, and the whole thing comes across as a bit of an overstuffed mess as a result. And yet, it's funny. It's really funny. And I love the callbacks with the crack in the wall, and there's enough here that the story feels like it should work on paper, and yet it feels off. The whole villain gallery shows up, but it feels so much less impactful or meaningful than it did in the Pandorica Opens, and much less impactful than the Doctor fighting against every villain in the show should feel. The idea of the Doctor spending hundreds of years as a charming old space grandad, protecting one town, mending their toys, etc., is the most 11th Doctor thing ever. Staying to save people because, and I quote, every life I save is a victory. There's a beautiful whimsy throughout, with some gorgeous callbacks, and even if that means the episode is a bit overstuffed, it's still enjoyable. It's a beautiful episode in small parts, when it's not being burdened by its fit-to-bursting plot. Handel's death is so emotional, considering it's the death of an emotionless gadget we've known for 30 minutes. There is so much weight to that moment, particularly in Matt Smith's performance. The scene between the old Doctor and Clara is beautifully written and performed, and I was so happy to see that it was set to Murray Gould's Four Knocks, which is one of my favourite pieces of music ever, and was wasted in a scene that I hated the first time around, but more on that later. I really enjoy the Never Tell Me the Rules speech, but the real highlight is the regeneration, which is the best regeneration in the show to my mind. Smith's speech of "we all change when you think about it" is the perfect antithesis to Tennant's awful proclamation that regeneration was like death. I nearly cry every time that Karen Gillan comes down those stairs, and that line, "Raggedy Man, good night," is one of my favourite lines ever. It's the end of the fairy tale, like a child being tucked into bed, as the tale of the madman in the box comes to a close. Every shot of this regeneration kills me, from the fish fingers and custard to the heartbreaking removal of the bow tie. Absolute perfection. And then, my favourite Doctor of all time turns up at the end. So in summary, this is a high-stakes mess, and not a particularly amazing end for the story of the 11th Doctor. But it is the perfect goodbye for the character of the 11th Doctor. The story is a mess, but the character and emotional beats are perfect. If only Smith had stayed for another series, I would love to have seen how his exit had panned out. 10th, the end of time. There are so many ideas being juggled about in this bizarre concoction that I don't really know where to start. But then that's part of the problem. There are so many ideas in the story, you could make a whole series out of it. Personally, I'm one of about 6 people that wishes that Tennant had gone out in Waters of Mars, but I don't really think the BBC were brave enough to allow the most popular Doctor ever die in shame after going too far. I suppose the best place to start is the start. The end of the RTD era devolved into an awful lot of prophecies, and whilst I enjoyed the Four Knocks prophecy because of the Wilf twist, the whole human race having prophetic visions is a bit much for me. Lucy Saxon is here for about 2 minutes, and I really wish there was more of her, considering the evident subtext about the domestic abuse she suffered in The Last of the Time Lords. Her 2-minute cameo here is a waste of a character, in order to resurrect John Sim. A word on Sim, he puts in a great performance here, despite being given some insanely stupid stuff to do, including being given crazy superpowers, turning into Skeletor and eating people in the campest way possible. Because despite all this, every scene where he is just talking with Tennant quietly together, they are magical. Bernard Cribbins is the real saving grace here though, and he steals every scene he is in. Murray Gould is also in fine form, but then, when isn't he? The Master is now a religious cult figure with a worshipping all-female group of followers in just one of about 1 million things that happens without any explanation. In fact, the whole of Part 1 is a total mess. It would be bottom of the list on its own, in spite of a handful of fun moments. It's nice to see June Whitfield and Barry Hard in the Silver Cloak, and Wilf is on top form, but some of the cringiest stuff in the whole Tennant era is crammed in here, particularly anything with the Master talking about food. The elephant in the room, of course, is the Master's plan. Honestly, it's daft, it's camp, and it's a bit superfluous to the actual story in the end. But I don't hate it, and John Sim is clearly having fun playing dress-up. The cliffhanger is when the episode finally steps into a much better, all-round story, with the reveal of the Time Lords bringing the RTD era to a natural conclusion, with Timothy Dalton as Rassilon being absolute dream casting. The second part is vastly superior, largely on an emotional level, because the plot's still a bit of a mess, but at least it's an enjoyable mess. There's a massive spaceship flight sequence with Wilf in a cactus, firing laser guns at missiles, and it's the sort of bombastic fun that I associate with the RTD era. It's all very theatrical and over the top, but the RTD era was never going to go out any other way. The real highlight of this story is that 5-minute scene of Wilf and Ten talking on a spaceship, which might be the most perfectly acted, perfectly written and intensely emotional scene in this entire era. The Master's redemption, of sorts, is a great moment, and I love how the euphoria of I'm still alive is quickly replaced with the shock twist of Wilf knocking 4 times, and the acting from Bernard Cribbins is impeccable. Unfortunately, and for reasons I'll never understand, the writers decided to ruin this scene by having Tennant throw his toys out the pram and have an angry rant about how Wilf isn't important, so why should he waste his life trying to save Wilf in a moment that I despise over any other moment in the RTD era. It's also set to the most beautiful piece of music Murray Gold ever wrote, which makes it doubly frustrating. Having Ten lose his life saving just one man was a great call. But it should have done it with the same heroism of Davison in the Caves of Androzani, or Capaldi in The Doctor Falls, rather than ranting to an elderly man about how his 900-year lifespan was too short and that he could do so much more. Tennant acts his heart out, but this scene really dampens my view of his Doctor. This level of vanity is a black mark against his reputation, in a scene that's quickly followed by some of my favourite moments of the era. The I Don't Want to Go is a bit on the nose, but the elongated goodbyes are perfect. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care how self-indulgent it is. The RTD era had earned this victory lap, and the last 15 minutes are gorgeous. It's a beautiful epilogue to a fantastic era. Overall, it's a tale of two halves, but it feels like a story that doesn't really know what it wants to be. And it's a disappointing end for Tennant because his era had so many of the best stories of the entire show. 9. Voyage of the Damned. Yep, more RTD on the bottom half of this list. I'm really not prepared for the backlash, am I? Another fan favourite, and I totally understand why. It's got a glorious cinematic blockbuster feel about it. It's an epic of epic proportions, with a fantastic cast, and featuring some of the best music in the history of the show. Seriously, Murray Gold, never have I missed anyone so much. There's a lot of great things about this story, but with one serious problem that probably knocked it a good way down this list, and that's the villains. Firstly, there is the knockoff Robots of Death Heavenly Host. They should be creepy, but they're not even a 20th as effective as the robot killers that Russell T was obviously taking his inspiration from. There's a very good reason for that. In Robots of Death, the villain's killed by strangulation. The scene where they try and strangle Pamela Salem's character while she is begging and screaming for her life is one of the creepiest scenes in Doctor Who history. By contrast, the host kill by removing frisbees from their heads and throw them at their victims, allowing a sequence where our cast fight off the host by playing a glorified game of rounders. That is why they don't work. And on top of that, there is the absolutely awful pantomime villain Max Capricorn, who looks ridiculous and cannot be taken seriously as a result. He is also afforded the most awfully campy and stupid looking death of all time. This villain problem is a real shame because there is some fantastic stuff in this episode. Clive Swift's Mr. Copper is an absolute joy every time he's on screen, whilst Russell Tovey is a real highlight alongside the late great Jeffrey Palmer. There is a first appearance for the spectacular Bernard Cribbins, and Kylie Minogue's Astrid is a surprise hit with a gut-wrenching death. David Tennant's performance is sublime in this episode. That scene when he tries to save Astrid desperately but to no avail is magnificent, and the choice of Rixton Slade as the one who survives is a really interesting one. And because of that, I find that this episode is massively important in Tennant's arc towards becoming the Time Lord Victorious, as Mr. Copper rightly points out that if you could decide who lived and who died, then that would make you a monster. 8th, the Christmas Invasion. I've become a much bigger fan of this one over the years. A couple of years ago, I would have been firmly in the dislike camp, but with each passing viewing, I've decided that not even an unhealthy dose of RTD era camp with killer Christmas trees and Santa robots can take away from what is a genuinely fun and solid outing, even if it is suffering from a distinct lack of Doctor for 75% of its run. It's definitely not particularly effective as a post-regeneration story, with the Doctor spending most of it wrapped up in bed whilst we watch an invasion without his presence, but man alive does this episode come alive when he wakes up, quotes the Lion King, gets in a sword fight and steals the whole show in 10 minutes. The more I watch this episode, the more I realise that the Tennant that we get in this episode is much closer to the much more sombre and darker Tennant of Series 3 and 4, which I vastly prefer to the sillier incarnation in Series 2. As with every RTD era script, there is some great dialogue spliced throughout that makes even the lesser elements fly by in a breeze of humour. The Sycorax are a really great villain, the design of their spaceship holds up and their masks are gorgeous. I can see why they rarely take them off. This is also the Harriet Jones episodes, and those jokes just keep getting better and better, and she is almost the main character for a large chunk of the episode. I must profess, however, that her fate is a bit of a problem for me. Not because she didn't deserve to be deposed, she committed a war crime, so she did. I just don't buy that those 6 words could bring down an entire government. It's a nice flex of the Doctor's supposed power, but it's more than a bit stupid. Overall, though, this one is deeply flawed and yet incredibly enjoyable. Far from the best of the RTD era, but it is the very best from a very mixed batch of RTD era Christmas specials. 7th, Resolution. If you can't believe the Chibnall episode has made the top half of this list, don't worry, nor can I. As someone who has loved a grand total of 3 episodes in the Chibnall era, this just so happens to be one of them. Most of this era has felt bland, unengaging, unexciting, and not even like Doctor Who. This episode falls into none of these Chibnall traps, and is actually an exciting and well-crafted episode that should have been the finale to Series 11, rather than the flat-out dull The Battle of Ranskorough Kolos. It isn't perfect by any stretch. Some of the video game CGI doesn't quite land, the micro-resolution is a bit stupid. Unfortunate that never worked before, eh? Makes the Daleks seem a much less credible threat if all they had to do in Dalek was dismantle the kitchenware. The Wi-Fi joke is one of the cringiest moments in the history of the show, and the abolition of UNIT absolutely enrages me. Bring it back now, Chibnall. Other than that, though, this is one of the best outings of the Whittaker era, with actual character work for Ryan, and character moments that feel natural rather than manufactured. Guest actors turning up in the TARDIS who are actually enjoyable for once, particularly Charlotte Ritchie's Lynn. Honestly, I was happy to drop the TARDIS team and take Lynn and Mitch by the end of the episode. The intro detailing an ancient battle with a Dalek is brilliant and feels epic in scope, and conveys the sense of the danger that a Dalek poses. The scenes with the Dalek possessing Lynn are great, and add almost a sense of body horror into the mix. Also, can I say this for possibly the only time ever, Segan Akinola was on top form here. This, and maybe Spyfall, are possibly the only scores he's done that I genuinely love. His drum-heavy Dalek theme is possibly his best work for the show yet, and I was so disappointed that it hardly featured in Revolution of the Daleks. In fact, the whole score in Revolution was so unobtrusive and background, whilst in this episode, it's front and centre and drives the episode at a pace, and allows the whole thing to actually feel like Doctor Who. Microwave aside, the Daleks are also done justice here. The focus on one Dalek allows the Daleks to feel like a huge threat, and I really feel that for all his flaws, Chibnall understands the Daleks, as evidenced by the amazing standoff between the Daleks and the military. Overall, it's not perfect, and I certainly understand some people's disdain towards it, but really it feels like a light shining in the dark of Chibnall's era, and it remains unquestionably his best Doctor Who script, in my book. 6th, The Husbands of River Song. I was a bit mixed on this episode when I first watched it, but with every passing viewing, its flaws seem to have evaporated, and what I've been left with is a hilarious, fun, and heartwarming tale that just doesn't take itself too seriously, and is just a joyous romp, with my favourite Doctor and the immaculate Alex Kingston putting in a fantastic final performance as River Song. There's almost, dare I say it, a Douglas Adams-esque flavour about this whole story. I just finished reading The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when I rewatched this, and I couldn't help noticing it in the playful humour and the bombastically odd aliens and concepts. There's just a tone throughout this story that feels so unique within the Capaldi era, which was often darker and much more brooding. It's so great to just get a story to see him have fun in a real, light-hearted story. I've used camp as a negative term in this video on several occasions, but may I say, this is how camp should be done. Greg Davis is wonderfully hammy as the dismembered head of King Hydroflax, as he threatens his terrible revenge on Capaldi whilst being trapped inside a bag. It's so warm and funny, and therefore perfect for Christmas, but that happiness is tinged with melancholy, and there's such a beautiful sadness about this one as the Doctor and River finally reach the Singing Tars, which, by the way, sound beautiful. Thank you, Mr. Marigold, once again. The rapport between Peter Capaldi and Alex Kingston is so good that honestly, they could carry this whole thing, even if the script was rubbish. Some of those final moments as they gaze upon the Singing Tars are just perfect. The subtle use of the silence in the library motif when he gives River the screwdriver being a particular highlight for me. But also that discussion about the true meaning of happily ever after is one of my favourite ever scenes. There is a theme of finality that runs through all the Capaldi Christmas specials, and this is another beautiful chapter in that underlying narrative. I cannot imagine a more perfect, more beautiful send-off for River Song than this episode. 5th, The Return of Dr Mysterio. This one catches a lot of flack, but personally, I won't hear a word against it. It's a wonderful ode to superhero movies, specifically Superman, that also shows off a clear love for comics. The dialogue throughout is wonderfully witty and quippy, with a handful of cheesy lines that are straight out of a comic book. I love all the little nods to comics, from all the characters with names that are alliterations such as Lucy Lombard and Grant Gordon, as well as having a really interesting visual style, with certain scenes specifically cut to look like comic books, such as during the phone call between the Ghost and Lucy. It's packed with superhero tropes like a secret identity crisis, awkward love triangles, the nerdy guy who gets the girl in the end, the balance of being a superhero against being a normal person, and of course, the villain kidnapping the love interest in order to use them as bait. Also, Peter Capaldi says, with great power comes great responsibility, and that's all I've ever needed from life. With all of this in mind, adding more than a dash of meta humour to entertain weirdos like me, this is an incredibly respectful parody that clearly has a lot of fun along the way. And I have a lot of fun with it. Nardole returns, who I wasn't a big fan of in the Husbands of River song, but he's much better here, although he isn't quite at the point where I loved him yet, but we get there fairly quickly in Series 10. We're getting a quick origin story, which, against all the odds, actually makes sense. And I like how it acknowledges that Grant got those specific powers because he was obsessed with comics. As well as positioning the Doctor not as the hero because Grant is the hero, but as a mentor or guardian figure who helps Grant attain his powers, taught him to control them, and watched over him, and now has returned all these years later and is still giving him advice. The Harmony Shoal are great villains with an interesting and distinct look, with a plan which is, as the Doctor points out, actually a very good plan and a unique take on an invasion story. Also, I have to mention this whole thing looks gorgeous, with the smoke rising from the street and on top of the buildings. It's just beautiful. There are also a lot of fun action sequences and a great turn from the guest cast, particularly our Lois Lane figure Lucy, who grows on me with every viewing. If you add all these elements together, fun, action humour, wit, meta-commentary, Peter Capaldi, a great side cast, a distinct visual style, superheroes, and a sequence with Primal Scream being played over the top of it, then you're onto a winner in my eyes. Also, that final scene when Capaldi talks about how everything ends is perfection. Moving up now, in fourth, The Snowmen. Another gem that seems to split the crowd, gorgeously funny, whimsical and inventive. This story is one I always enjoy watching. The Snowmen of the episode's title are absolute non-entities, but I'm just here for the best companion that we never had, the Victorian governess iteration of Clara. Honestly, despite being among an amazing cast of heroes and villains, it's Jenna Coleman that steals the show and anchors the whole episode. For me, this one-off Clara was a much more interesting character than the one we got in Series 7B. I'm not sure the one-off companion has ever endeared herself to me this quickly. She's quick-witted, clever, feisty, and has a great rapport with Matt Smith. In my eyes, Series 7A, whilst being a fairly solid run of episodes, had lost some of that Moffat fairy tale whimsy, and this episode brings that element back in spades. I mean, the Doctor climbs an invisible staircase to the sky, where he's sulking on a blue box on a cloud. That's just genius. The Paternoster gang are a bit Marmite apparently, but I'm a big fan, and I think they're at their best in this episode, with brilliant line after line. The real villain of this episode isn't the lacklustre Snowmen, but rather the Great Intelligence, fronted by Dr. Simeon. This gives us the dream pairing of Richard E. Grant and Sir Ian McKellen, who are brilliant with what they are given. They just aren't as memorable as a villain pairing like that should be. I do enjoy having the Great Intelligence here, with plenty of nice callbacks, including a handful of nods to the Web of Fear, which is my favourite second Doctor story, and I love that little strategic weakness line from Matt Smith. Murray Gold is on top of his game here also. I realise I've said that in nearly every pick on this list, but I will never stop praising Murray Gold. His magical fairy tale score makes this episode feel like such an immersive experience. As with any Christmas special, there's more than a dash of melancholy, as the Doctor mourns Amy and Rory, whilst Clara's death at the end packs quite a punch, considering we are fully aware that there is another one coming along by the end of the episode. So it's a really stellar episode sandwiched in between two halves of a very inconsistent series. Third, Twice Upon a Time. First things first, yes, I hate the utterly awful sexist First Doctor jokes as much as everybody else does. I feel the script misunderstands the character of the First Doctor and writes him just as a parody of the Doctor we met in the first couple of stories in Season 1, totally forgetting all his development by the time the 10th planet came along. David Bradley certainly looks the part and speaks the part, but I think he lacks that twinkle in the eye and that mischievous laugh that made William Hartnell's incarnation such a joy. But away from that element, I think this story is perfect in every other aspect. In my head, this is the sort of story that Peter Capaldi should have gone out on. This incarnation who had lost so much, people always talk about Tennant, but Capaldi lost Clara, Bill, River, and Nardole, and in his mind he had just lost a battle with Missy, with her leaving in the Doctor Falls, and the Doctor never knowing that he managed to change her mind, and that she died doing the right thing. This is an episode where the Doctor, whose entire mantra is just be kind, has his faith in the universe restored, and that's because there isn't an evil plan. And I like that. People say it makes the episode feel pointless, but it's a character piece, and the Doctor doesn't have to fight off squid monsters every week. This week the Doctor has his faith restored by witnessing the Christmas miracle, and it's inch perfect for 12. Capaldi's exit was never going to be a big Tennant melodrama like The End of Time, and a much more personal, emotional story is the perfect way for this Doctor and this era to bow out. The whole episode looks beautiful, with Rachel Talalay's direction here absolutely stunning. How she hasn't been invited back in the Chibnall era is baffling to me. Stephen Moffat's time on the show comes full circle with a visit to Villengard, whilst Mark Gatiss gets a brilliant final outing as the Captain, who is just a brilliant character. I love his reaction to the world's World War I, it's so heartbreaking, and I love his willingness to be sacrificed for Bill, and his speech about the people who will miss him, and about how hope makes one ever so afraid. His final moments with the salute after he is revealed to be a Lethbridge Stewart are gorgeous. A lot of stuff comes full circle in this episode. We remember just how far Capaldi has come when meeting Rusty, and hearing Rusty say that the Doctor was the one who taught him to hate, as well as the parallels drawn between this and Deep Breath, when Bill says that the Doctor is looking at her but not seeing her. Speaking of Bill, they somehow managed to find a way of bringing her back that didn't feel cheap, but somehow works. As much as I'm not a fan of the First Doctor stuff, there are some great moments, and I'm just not just the beautiful fan service of seeing that TARDIS, getting the 10th planet rescored with Veil de Sem, and of course the Time Vortex, which the show 100% should have kept. There is a great evaluation of just how far the Doctor has come, particularly with the First Doctor's bemused reaction to the 12th Doctor's big "I will stop you" speech. The scene with David Bradley and Bill Potts talking about why he left Gallifrey is exquisite, and it's the perfect answer to those questions that Moffat has been teasing throughout his entire run. And although the Timeless Child has tried to destroy these ideas, that doesn't take away from the fact that, for me, these will always be the answers in my book. The line about the universe generally failing to be a fairy tale, but that's where the Doctor comes in, is the perfect closeout to the Moffat years, and shows just how much he understands this character. Murray Gold gets a victory lap with his greatest hits that he has absolutely earned. There is not an episode that goes past that I don't miss him more and more. The final scenes are perfect in every possible way. Getting Clara's memories back, the heartbreaking battlefield speech, and that hug as Bill and Nardole disappear before him, gets me every time. The final speech is a beloved goodbye to this character, from both Moffat and Capaldi. This was the day I lost Capaldi, Moffat and Gold, and I'm really not sure I'm over it. Second, Last Christmas. Just about bettering Twice Upon a Time as my favourite Peter Capaldi Christmas special is Last Christmas. What I love about this episode is it does something that few other Christmas specials, which tend to sort of detach themselves from the series, do, which is it acts as a sort of epilogue to Series 8. Now, I'm a big Series 8 fan, and this is the perfect tie-up to the three character arcs for that series, that of the 12th Doctor, Clara, and Danny. As a fan of all these characters, yes, even Danny, this one is even better. This episode is the perfect mix of sci-fi and Christmas whimsy, as well as somehow sensibly working Santa into the story in the best way possible. The show could have done this in a very serious manner, and it would have been fine, but it's playful with its concepts, and it's all the better for it. Nick Frost is a decent enough Santa, but it's the witty Moffat dialogue with its playful discussion of Santa mythology that makes this one such a joy to watch. Any interaction between the 12th Doctor and literally anyone in this episode is an absolute joy, and yet there are heartbreaking moments abound. The confessions between him and Clara about their lies and death in heaven is so subtly underplayed, it's perfect. The dream sequence between Clara and Danny is better than anything between them in Series 8, and I love Series 8. It's such a beautiful yet slightly unsettling moment, with Clara basically embracing death as long as she dies happy. Merry Christmas, everyone! The villains are a creepy and cool concept, and yes, I know they're ripped from Alien, but at least the episode acknowledges that and works it into the plot. The dreams within dreams make for some amazing dream sequences, particularly the chalkboards in Clara's house. There's a well-written guest cast that are funny, interesting, and yet slightly unsettling at points with their "it's a long story" response. I know Shona was touted as the next companion, but for me, as much as I enjoy her, I think she would have probably been a little bit much for me on a full-time basis. The sleigh scene is beautifully cheesy and overtly Christmassy. There's a fine line of ridiculousness, but luckily if you're in a dream you can practically get away with anything. The final scenes with Clara would have been the perfect goodbye. The conversation, the Christmas cracker callback, and the cutaway to the young Clara, and yet I love the twist. I cannot even put into words how happy that final scene makes me. Set to one of my favourite pieces of Murray Gold music, the elation of both characters is infectious, and I get chills every time. But that means that number one is, of course, A Christmas Carol. This was never in doubt. I will watch this episode every Christmas for the rest of my Doctor Who filled life. Beautiful Christmas viewing, poetic and gorgeous, as well as an incredibly heartwarming to watch. I cannot imagine this Dickensian classic being utilised in this show any better. I don't think I could find an issue to talk about if I wanted to. It's set on one of the most interesting ideas for a planet we've had in this distinctly Earth-based New Who. Fish that swim in fog is the right level of quirky and bombastic that I want to see. We need more planets like this because, unlike in classic Who, where they did write interesting planets on a regular basis, the budget is now there that they can pull stuff like this off. Getting Michael Gambon to play our Scrooge character is one of the most exquisite pieces of casting in all Doctor Who, and he pulls it off so well. Unlike the paper-thin Narnia parody from the following year, this story leans heavily into its Dickensian source material, with the Doctor openly admitting to ripping off his plan from the novel. This is the perfect use of a time travel to meddle in someone's life, and I love how we see consequences of the events on the present as we see the Doctor doing them in the past. Kazran is changed in the present until the trip to Miami, where Abigail reveals the truth, which sours the older Kazran, just changing his motivations for his lack of care. I like how there's actual consequences to the Doctor's actions. He does manipulate a man's entire life to suit his own ends, and that's quite dark. And it would be cheap if this just worked out perfectly, but instead the heartless older Kazran is now a broken-hearted older Kazran who hates the Doctor to such an extent that he is willing to let all those people die just to prove that he isn't like the Doctor. He isn't like you, and he never will care. And even after the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come does change his mind, he has messed with Kazran so much he can no longer operate the isomorphic controls. This story is stacked with heartwarming and quotable moments, as well as a fantastic score from Murray Gold. It's witty and playful, and that's all I want from a Moffat script. Catherine Jenkins is fantastic in this, and apparently she had never acted in anything before, but she's really brilliant, as is the two actors for the young Kazran. This is probably the most Christmassy Christmas special of all time, but it doesn't need Santa robots or bauble grenades. This ticks every box for a Christmas special. It's whimsical, magical and funny, with more than a dash of melancholic sadness, and it makes this episode for me unquestionably the greatest festive special of them all.